Welcome to Beyond Intervening, Strengths, Limitations, and Implications for Bystander Intervention Research, a conversation with Rose Hennessy. This is part of the National Sexual Violence Resource Center's Research to Practice initiative, where we bring together researchers, preventionists, and advocates to explore current topics of research and the ways we can be implementing and exploring that research within our everyday work with one another. I am Taylor Teichman, Project Coordinator with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and I am joined today by my colleague Sally Lasky and our very special guest, Rose Hennessy. So before we dive into our conversation, I'd like to hand it over for just some brief introductions. So Sally, would you mind just introducing yourself quickly, and then we'll have Rose introduce herself as well.
Thank you, Taylor. I would love to. It's great to be here with you and Rose today. My name is Sally Lasky, and I'm the Evaluation Coordinator at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center.
Thank you, Sally. And Rose, we are so excited that you're joining us today. Would you mind just introducing yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here this morning or whenever people are listening. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the Joseph Silber School of Public Health. That's here in Wisconsin. And in addition to trying to finish up school, I also teach courses at the undergraduate and graduate level in public health and social work. And I've got about a decade of experience working in the sexual violence field, primarily from the prevention and evaluation end. So doing some direct practice, working at the coalition level, and in more recent years, evaluating programs.
Thank you so much. And again, we are very excited to be having this conversation with you today. And so we'll get started and let's dive in. So our first question, we're wondering, our very first research to practice event, I should say, actually took place in 2011 and was focused on the topic of bystander intervention research. So this approach to sexual violence prevention is extremely common in our field, and the research base has been steadily growing. So we're wondering, in your review of the literature, what have you really gathered about program effectiveness over the years?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that question. So before I get started and talk about some of the things that I've gleaned and learned about research, I just want to be very transparent about how I'm coming at the research myself. So, the framework that we use and the positionality that we have does even influence the way we interpret research. So, I try as hard as I can to read things and share them the way that they're written and seen, but that's still through my lens. And, I'm a white, able-bodied woman. English is my first language. I was born in the U.S. So just to be very transparent about where that one interpretation is coming from on our conversation today, and that multiple interpretations are needed so that we can get a really good full picture of what's happening. So when you ask about, what have we found about program effectiveness, I conducted a systematic literature review from 2007 actually to 2017. It was a decade, and we pulled out 164 articles in some major databases. And then I had a research assistant, a graduate student in one of my courses, pull out an additional number of 15 articles from 2018 to May of this year. And then because I knew I was coming to record this, I actually just kind of went through and did a quick and dirty review of the last few months to make sure we didn't miss anything. And I skimmed some of that research, but I specifically am going to talk about one systematic review that was published during that time. So just to give you an idea of where this research is coming from. So the first thing I want to point out is that when we think about effectiveness, we have some qualitative research that's been happening for a number of years. Qualitative meaning that people ask open-ended questions like, after you took this training, have you ever done something differently? Have your attitudes changed? Probably more specific questions. And that consistently, for over a decade, these studies have demonstrated positive attitudes, behavioral intentions being like, oh, if something happened, I would do something, and actual bystander behaviors themselves. So yes, there was this situation happened, I saw someone who looked like they possibly were going to be sexually assaulted, and I actually took this behavior in action. So that kind of work has been happening. It's been happening in some kind of unique ways. One researcher, all of this too, I should say, to give context, is at the college level. That's where I'm studying. So there's also bystander literature, maybe in the workplace or K-12 or in other settings. I'm focusing on a college population here, but they would actually knock on dorm rooms and after trainings, like 3 months after or 9 months after, and give them forms and say, oh, like, can you fill this out as part of our research study? So that work has been going on. And then when we think about more quantitative or systematic statistics, I want to just real briefly touch on some findings from 3 systematic reviews and meta-analyses. They're actually both. And I put up these pictures of grapes because I feel like they're a good symbol of what those are. So in a grapevine, you have one vine, and then you have all the actual berries underneath. That's kind of like a review. So a researcher takes one study where they look for a bunch of other studies that fit into their requirements. So the first one, or the first bunch of grapes, actually happened in 2013, and the research that was found there was that there's an effect size of about 0.5 for bystander efficacy and 0.2 for bystander behaviors. Now, what does that mean? I do think that it's really important to talk about systematic reviews and analyses when we talk about effectiveness, because looking at one study can be very biased or it can be very subjective to one population. But when we start combining multiple studies across the U.S., across populations, we get a better depiction of what's going on. In a meta-analysis, researchers will take all of the findings that they find and come up with a number between 0 and 1, and that's called the effect size. The bigger the number, the stronger the effectiveness, in our case, of how effective a bystander intervention program is. 0 meaning no effectiveness. So when we think about building efficacy or confidence at 0.5, that's considered a moderate effect. And when we think about bystander behaviors at 0.2, that's a smaller effect, both of which are statistically significant. Now, the second bunch of grapes or reviews actually found very similar findings, improved attitudes and beliefs at small to moderate levels. They also found that these effects decreased over time but remain significant. Why does that matter? I think there's this big conversation in the literature about one-time sessions aren't enough to change behaviors, and what does it mean to start including booster sessions? But if we're doing a training and people are still engaging in more behavior at a significant level compared to a control group 3 months later, I think that's a really awesome finding. It means we still need to do more, but that some of this stuff does have some effect. This review also found that there was no effect of facilitator or audience gender, which I think has good practice implications. So people are always like, is it better to have pure facilitators or professionals implementing, bystander programs in person to young people? And they said, we didn't find any difference depending on who the facilitator was. Also, conversations historically about should we separate audience participants by gender, put women over here, men over here. Obviously, there's some gender binary issues with that, and it doesn't take into account transgenders, students who are in certain spaces and their safety. But this review also found that there was no effect on behaviors or attitudes based on the audience. So if all of the students were together by gender, they got the same effects. If they were separated, they got the same effects. So some nice kind of implications for people who are doing practice. And then the third review, and the last thing I just want to talk about when it comes to effectiveness, is that this third review found similar findings, but the last two both found that there were no significant effects on decreasing perpetration. So why does that matter, and why is that a huge take-home about effectiveness? Bystander intervention kind of emerged as a new way to prevent sexual assault and sexual violence, but they're actually starting to measure just in the last few years, do these programs have any influence on victimization or perpetration? And there's some theoretical pathways. You could say like, well, if I'm sitting in a training and I hear these things, it might change my own personal behavior of how I act. But 2 of these reviews have found consistently that this isn't decreasing perpetration. So it's great that people are engaging in more behaviors. There's a lot of social norms. There might be a lot of interruption of behaviors themselves, but we actually now have 2 reviews, still a small number of studies, probably 10 in a limited number of programs, but are saying that we're not finding that as well. And then the last thing in this review that found, again, a positive effect on bystander behavior, small to moderate, is that they didn't find any differences on whether a program was implemented online versus in person, or the gender framing of sexual assault. And this review was published this year in 2019. We have a reference list at the end where you could look at this. And I think that's really interesting because another practice-based issue that's come up over and over again is, when we implement our bystander program, what should we come from a framework that this is a violence against women issue, women are disproportionately impacted, and transgender folks are disproportionately impacted by victimization, especially when we look at rape, and men are more likely to perpetrate. Some folks say that's off-putting, it's going to make people less likely to want to engage, and then there's kind of this neutral approach, right, where we come in, anyone can be a victim, anyone can be a perpetrator, we all have a role to play. So this researcher actually coded the programs and said, depending on how people framed it either way, they actually found no effect on behaviors. It still increased behaviors in the participants. So that's another interesting finding that approach comes in. So I think that was it in terms of effectiveness. One more comment that intervening, all of these programs are like, did behaviors increase? Did attitudes increase? It's different to intervene once versus to always intervene, and the opportunity matters. So we're starting to look at new innovative ways to measure things so that, if there are 3 paths in front of someone, 3 opportunities to intervene, they might walk down 1 path or they might walk down 2 paths. Does that mean that their behaviors increased, but they didn't walk down the 3rd? And while they might do it today, if tomorrow it gets dark and the context changes, that might also change the way people intervene. So there's some big nuances in answering this, is the program effective? I think a better question is, in what ways is it effective, in what context, and for who?
Thank you so much for sharing. That is really helpful, and I appreciate your visuals and your explanation. I feel like as you've kind of broken those down into those 3 reviews, that's been extremely helpful to help kind of understand the effectiveness. So I appreciate you sharing that. I'm wondering if you can also talk a little bit about the consequences of bystander intervention programs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think it's just a really exciting time to be studying this because this research is all coming out in the last 2 to 3 years, and there's more coming. So that the question about effectiveness is do people intervene? Do their attitudes change? But what happens next? What are the consequences? And even in this article published in 2018, quoting the authors, little research has explored what happens after. But we have a little bit, so let's look at that little bit. First of all, it's important to note that consequences can be good, bad, or neutral, probably a lot of other things. There's 2 studies within one that came out that said about 15 to 20% of students who had an opportunity to intervene and did intervene reported a negative consequence. What were those negative consequences? Being verbally harassed, getting into trouble for perhaps they were underage drinking and then they called the police, and so now they're in trouble because they were drinking, but they were trying to intervene and do something. Most of the people, that 15 to 20% who report a negative consequence, are reporting more than one. I was physically assaulted and I was verbally harassed and I got in trouble. But a study that I think is super interesting, they came out, and this is the White study in 2017, if you're looking at references at the end, and they gave 19 different scenarios, and they asked people who had intervened, in these scenarios, I want you to check yes or no if you felt a number of words afterwards. So it'd be like scenario, I heard a joke about rape. I don't think that's one of them, but it's an example. And then what did you do? I told my friend that's not cool. So then they said, after you did that, did you feel good about it? Yes or no? Did you feel proud? Did you feel empowered? Did you feel neutral, bad, regretful, scared, traumatized, or embarrassed? And one of, I think, fascinating findings is that in all 19 of the scenarios that they provided, students reported significantly that they were more likely to feel good than not to feel good. So we have some like positive consequence or aftermath of students saying like, I felt good. In 16 of 19 scenarios, they felt proud, and half of them they felt empowered. Compared to students who did intervene, those that didn't. So I got the scenario of the rape joke, and what I wrote is I didn't do anything. Then I got the same set of words, and significantly, all of those people were reported that they felt neutral in all 19 of the scenarios. They were more likely to feel neutral than to not feel neutral, because these are binary yes/no questions. And in over half of them, they felt bad and regretful. So we talk about safety and concerns, but in our trainings, are we also mentioning that when people actually step up, we have some initial research to show that they're more likely to feel good, proud, and empowered. And when they don't intervene, they're more likely to feel neutral, bad, and regretful. I thought that was a really unique study. The same researchers actually also asked about vicarious trauma symptoms. So in our field, we talk a lot about burnout for people who help others, frequently with victimization, but also even on the prevention side, like there's a burnout that comes with having to talk about how we're going to prevent violence over and over and over again to audiences that aren't always very receptive. And they're like, do bystanders experience those same effects that, there's kind of this burnout that might come? So they found that students who, because remember, again, these are all college samples, students that witness and intervene are more likely or approaching significance to have post-traumatic stress symptoms. And that just witnessing these events, and we can imagine that, right? Like you witness someone who's about to be sexually assaulted, like that, can be a traumatic event for people just seeing it. So witnessing these things is more associated with having depression symptoms. But, and here's a cool finding, when students intervene, there is no significance. So they say, if students witness things, they're more likely to feel depressed. But if they witness them and intervene, the depression symptoms are no longer significantly there. And so they kind of talk about how there's this bittersweet outcome that many bystanders, they feel good about intervening, but they're at risk for post-traumatic stress symptoms. And sometimes if they don't intervene, they might even be at higher risk for depression. So this is one study. Obviously, it's hard to make generalizing conclusions from one of those things. That's why we like those systematic reviews, but some initial thoughts there. And then in the research I'm currently doing, we are asking people after they intervene on a scale of 1 to 7, how harmful or helpful did you feel like your response was? And then your experience as a bystander, how would you rate it from a scale of 1 to 7 being negative or positive? So we're analyzing that data right now and excited to be able to contribute to this conversation about what happens next. Oh, and then one more thing that I wanted to bring up is that there's not, and when we talk about consequences of intervening, this is all about bystanders, but we can also think about how do the potential perpetrators and victims respond? And is that response different based on the strategy that the intervener chooses? So scenario to depict that. Again, someone hears a joke about rape. So I am an intervener, I say that's not cool. So how does the person who said that comment feel about what I said? And in a more victim perpetration setting, I see someone trying to isolate an intoxicated person into a room. So potential perpetrator, the one dragging away, potential victim, the one being dragged away. I step in and say, hey, she lost her car keys. I have to grab her for a second, or I have to grab them for a second. So that would be a distancing intervention. So what this study, and I mentioned it earlier, actually took open-ended data. So people wrote in, I would go up to the person and separate them, and then they coded them to figure out what kind of strategy students use. So in 43% of the scenarios, they mentioned a distancing. So somehow I created distance between a potential victim and perpetrator. And then distraction. Everyone in intervention has seen these Ds. They also add a fifth one in. We know that things co-occur. So you can see that a third of distraction interventions occur with distance. So it's like, look over here, or oh, we want to go and get another drink. Come on, we should do that. Come with me. I created a distraction and I created distance. So when we're talking about consequences and what happens next, again, one study, but they found that when distance interventions occurred, there were more negative responses from victims and perpetrators. And then when direct interventions, so direct meaning, I would go right up and say, I'm worried about you being dragged away or whatever. I want you to come with me. Or I'd go up, I'm worried that you're taking my friend, and I don't think that that's okay. A direct comment. These were actually more likely to be associated with positive responses from victims and perpetrators, which I just think is a fascinating finding, that a more direct approach is leading to more positive responses from a combined group of victims and perpetrators. And the conversation is much more complicated. I encourage you to, the reason I put the citation up here, to look at that article. They actually go through each one of those interventions and talk more about negativity and positivity. So overall, what are consequences of intervening? There's some good stuff. Students might be at risk for some traumatic effects, and the responses of victims and perpetrators likely vary based on the strategies that bystanders use in the different situations.
Rose, this is Sally. It definitely is complex, and with most bystander intervention programs being developed and used with white college students in mind, what have you found in the literature about outcomes for people of color?
I'm glad you bring that up. I had much more data that I wanted to show, because it's like you're a researcher and you just can't help it. And luckily, these lovely people that I'm working with on the webinar were like, we need to cut this down so people will actually listen. Wise people. But one of the things that you would have seen if I showed each study in more detail, and you could see if you look it up, I do not have any published data to support this, but in most of the research that I have found, and in one review that I did that isn't published, I found that in all scenarios, in most studies, 66, about 2/3 of the sample are women, and 70% or more of the samples are white or Caucasian. So everything that we're learning, everything that we're even studying, because the tools that we use to measure are based on populations primarily 2/3 women, 70% or more white. So this has a huge impact on what we know and how transferable this is to other populations and students of color. What we know to date, which everyone who's listening probably knows, is that there's very few research being published on this, and there are mixed findings. So even when research is being published, sometimes things are kind of contradictory, and that makes it confusing to have a narrative. Like, we have certain narratives. Women are more likely to intervene than men in most scenarios related to sexual violence. That's a narrative that a lot of people have as a talking point, and there's a decent amount of research to support that. For people who are interested in learning more, I really recommend this article. It was published last year. The citation is on the top, and a quote from the author that current research generally suffers from a lack of diversity, specifically racial and ethnic diversity in the study samples, despite the diversity of most campus communities. So I think that this is a really telling comment, and it puts a lot of the onus on me and on other researchers and evaluators and our practitioners to say, it's one thing if we have a harder time finding access, but why do we have such little research and information when we do have diverse campus communities? What is happening there? The one thing that I do want to say is that consistently a number of studies have reported that there are differences. There's about 3 studies listed in the background of this paper, and if I had more time, I'd go through all of them, and I'd recommend that you check them out. But what they're finding is that students do have different opportunities to intervene based on their race ethnicity. And that has been actually repeated in at least 2 or 3 studies, so we have a little bit of repetition. And what that means is when we ask about scenarios, like I was like 19 scenarios, did you hear a joke about rape? Did you see someone who is intoxicated being pulled away? That overall less students of color are likely to see those opportunities, or to report having those opportunities. Not in every study, because there's some mixed findings, but I think that's a bigger theme. And it brings up this question of whether the questions and the study design itself is actually reflecting the experiences of students of color. Like, are the way that they are having these opportunities and witnessing these events culturally specific and different and not captured in our own measurement tools? So then it looks like they have less opportunity. Another finding that I think we need to think about when we talk about this is we're talking about intervention overall in a colorblind manner. There was at least one study published that showed that white men were the least likely to intervene, African American women were the most likely to intervene, and white women were less likely to intervene if the victim was black. So it's not just are students of a certain color more likely to intervene or not. Gender and race intersect to create the opportunities that people have, what they witness, how they intervene, what strategies they choose, and race within intervention. Who is the person who's the bystander? Who's the potential victim? Who's the potential perpetrator? The race, ethnicity, and gender, and many other characteristics of those people actually determine the intervention strategies that are chosen. So again, this is another complex narrative. I think a nice take-home message from the author is that the implication for public health practice, or whatever practice, is that students of color may be further marginalized when programs aim to increase their behaviors do not actually consider their experiences as bystanders. So we have a lot more work to do in this field before we can say more. And this is really critical to make sure that all of our students are being served and that we are creating social norms that are culturally specific through our bystander programs, and that we're trying to stop behaviors that are actually happening in different communities.
Thank you again so much for sharing. I think lastly, one of our questions for you is around how can this research really inform our prevention practices?
All right, great. The one thing I'll say is I normally like to think about practice implications in relationship with practitioners, especially because I find myself more and more on the research end. So some of these ideas that I'm going to share, I've got about 4 of them about how this research can inform practice, are things that I've thought of. Some of them are conversations, and I want to give those practitioners, even if not by name, credit for helping to inform them as well. So the first thought I have is that bystander intervention is one solution to sexual violence. It is not the solution. And I have this candle up here because I feel like it matches the metaphor of a dark room and having to deal with violence. And that lighting a candle is kind of like a bystander intervention program. We create light in that dark space, and it's a good step. But that single candle isn't going to make the room light. That we're going to have to light multiple candles in order to get out of that darkness and into a world without violence. Because I really don't believe that we are going to intervene our way out of sexual violence. Research is showing that the people who participate in these programs, while they might be engaging in social norm change, different attitudes, behaviors that sometimes interrupt or stop violence, that it's not actually changing their own perpetration. Again, maybe more studies will show differently. It's not changing victimization in all of these contexts. So that bystander intervention, I think there's great things about it. I think it emerged and became very popular, kind of like the DARE program, because it feels really good. It feels really good to get in a room and say, we can all be part of this solution and we can all step up and take change together. And that is great, and we should absolutely consider to do that. But I don't think we should do it at the expense of not talking about systematic forms of oppression. If we ignore sexism, if we ignore racism, if we ignore homophobia, if we ignore the whole entire disability community, which in that comment of like, we can all step up and do good things, none of that's coming in, I don't think we're going to be able to really prevent sexual violence in all contexts. And when we consider the fact that about a third of sexual violence is witnessed, a third is a lot, but that still means that the majority of sexual violence isn't happening around bystanders. So we're going to need further interventions to decrease perpetration and victimization to get at those other categories while we continue to engage in this really important social norms work to try to change the culture. Second implication, I think, of what this research can mean for practice is that I'd like to start seeing us getting really real about what happens after we intervene. Bystander intervention still kind of has this put on your cape, superhero, fly in and save the day feel to it. And even I think all of us, as we sit and preach these things and listen to these things, we can point to a time in our own life where maybe we didn't intervene the way we wish we had because it's complicated and it's complex and people have personal histories of victimization and trauma, and there are power and privilege dynamics, and that in trainings, most of the conversation, I feel, looks like this. We need to consider safety, so maybe you don't always need to be intervening. There are some situations where it may not be safe and you should consider that. I think every training talks about that, but that's where a lot of it ends. Like the period is after that sentence. And now that we have more research and scenarios, getting very real about what does it mean when 15 to 20% of the people who intervene might experience a very real negative consequence of being threatened, of getting into trouble, of influencing their lives. What are those real conversations and what resources exist for students? Are there bystander intervention support groups? Are we handing out, you don't have to go see a therapist after a, potentially after an opportunity that presented itself that you intervened or didn't intervene, but you might want to bounce it off someone. You might want to talk about, if that happens again, what could you do next, or what could you do now? And where is it that students are supposed to go and have those conversations? What resources exist? So if we're going to ask young, brilliant people to stand up and put on their capes and try to engage in some of the stuff that can put them at risk, even when they feel good about it, how do we support them to actually do that? And further, how do we include privilege into that conversation about who's stepping up when? And do we really, I even think that I don't have an answer to this, but should people always be intervening? A lot of programs say no, there are situations where we shouldn't be. And I wonder, how does that tie into power and privilege of the times that I get to check out and say, no, I'm not going to intervene here? Could we reframe that narrative to say, we care about our communities, that we should always be intervening, but we might need to choose a strategy that's the most safe for us? So is there something that I could always do to create safer communities, to show that I care about my fellow human beings, even if it doesn't look like the direct cape, fly and save the day kind of thing? So I think that getting real about what that could be really helpful in our programs, and that students would really resonate with it too, because they know the consequences. Another implication is considering whether the suggested strategies that we provide are relevant and helpful. So what I mean by that, a lot of programs will include, here are a list of things you could say or a list of things that you could do. So for instance, you could use an approach of an I statement, I feel uncomfortable when you use that language. Or all kinds of different engagement strategies, phrases, opportunities. So we promote these things in trainings, but we actually don't have a lot of evidence about how effective they are or not. So I showed that one slide where it seems like direct intervention strategies are more likely to elicit positive responses from perpetrators and victims. So should we be giving students that information? And how do we learn more from a research and measurement side about what's helpful? I think for now, using participant informed trainings is one of the solutions to deal with that. So I have like the sign there and it says path pointed both ways, because I'm wondering if the strategies that we're suggesting to students, they're like, I'm never going to use that. That's not relevant to my life. Or the things that the experiences that you're giving, they're not stuff I ever experienced. And sometimes it's like you can almost see it on the face of training participants when you like throw out different options of what you could say or do. Like they give you this look like, that's never going to happen. Like I'm never going to say that. So I wonder how we reframe these trainings to be like, what is it? Here's the scenario. What is it that you did say? How did that go for you? What happened next? And in our evaluation forms, using those responses in future trainings. Like we found that 30% of students from our training last year said that this is what they would do in this scenario. What do you think about that? And then we asked them how effective it was, and most of them were like, that did not go very well. So how about we all together create buy-in about why we need a different strategy or promote the things that we think may or may not be more effective. And then last but not least, I think we really do need diverse collaborations in order to address some of the limitations, some of the major limitations that we have in our research. Not only do we need collaboration, but we need intentional spaces and funding to build these and sustain these. I heard a practitioner ask, where do I find a researcher or an evaluator to help me evaluate my program? Like, where do I just find someone to do this? I thought it was a very telling question. There are occasional pockets of money. I think even NSVRC or another organization once did like a call for programs. Like, do you think your program is great and worth evaluating? Like, we want to connect with you. We want to, get people connected to researchers and make that happen. But this stuff is not intentional. So the kind of colorblind aspect that I haven't talked about in this program, when I did that review of effectiveness, I can name to you on two hands all of the programs that have been reviewed. We've got Green Dot, we've got Bringing in the Bystander, we have Take Care, we have Real Consent, we have the men's program. So there's like a number of programs. When you even just listen to the names, none of these programs are culturally specific. These are like one size fits all onto a college population. That doesn't mean they're bad, and they do, most of them include spaces to have conversations about what happens in this scenario, or, if the race ethnicity is different, or someone is in a homosexual relationship. So there's like these kind of tidbits and opportunities, but all of our research continues to be on these mainstream programs. And I think until we start building diverse collaborations with intentional spaces and funding, we're going to continue to see that, because it's going to be the context and opportunity of where researchers are and who they're working with. And that, we're going to continue to see 2/3 of our study samples being women and 70% or more being white until we change this. I think another solution is partnering across universities. So sometimes people say like, okay, we do have diversity on our campus. We could do some qualitative work. Yes, do that. That's important. We could do some pilot studies. Oh my gosh, do that. Great. But if we partner, if we partner with multiple institutions, perhaps we can build up that sample size. I mean, we have Hispanic serving institutions that wouldn't even have to partner with anyone, where we would have really large sample sizes to start making some conclusions about, opportunities that people have, what they're witnessing, what they're experiencing, how they're intervening, how training impacts them. And I really hope that this is the kind of thing that we're gonna need from the ground up and up down in order to make these changes, so that our research is really serving all of our communities.
I am confident that what you've been able to share today is going to spark a lot of conversation, a lot of different types of partnerships. And I think one of the, superpowers of our field is our ability to listen and to learn and ultimately improve our work to prevent sexual violence. I just want to thank you so much on behalf of the NSVRC for the work that you're doing and then taking the time to share what you're learning with us. I know I have a long list of things that I am going to do as far as reaching out to new partners, reading additional research, and talking to more folks. I invite folks that are listening, if you have a question or want to learn more, Rose has kindly offered her email to folks, and the NSVRC prevention team is here for any and all questions about bystander intervention, research about bystander intervention, or sexual violence prevention in general. Please contact us at prevention@nsvrc.org. And I just thank everyone so much for taking the time to listen. We have some additional resources that we have available online. The first URL we're sharing in the slides is actually a list compiled by Rose about research of interest. And then we also have an online special collection on the NSVRC website. Feel free to follow that link directly or just come to nsvrc.org and type bystander intervention into our search function and you will find all of our bystander intervention resources.